Really looking forward to the next presentation. My very good colleague, Chief Data Officer in Experian Northern Europe, Mr. Andy Wills, is going to speak about the global and European economic trends. Welcome to the stage, Andy.
Thank you, Bo. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about macroeconomics. Just before I get into that, Experian has got two macroeconomic forecasting teams, one for Europe that looks also after Asia Pacific, based in London, and one that is based in North America, looking at the rest of the world. So the content I'm going to present will be a combination of output that comes out of the Experian economics forecasting teams, but also there's quite a lot of external content that's generally available, World Bank, IMF, OECD, and some materials that some of the major banks and the other central banks kind of generate. Of course, macroeconomics is important to us all, and it's important specifically within the credit industry because it feeds directly into your thinking regarding risk and capital provisioning. Hopefully it'll be an interesting topic for you. If I just start to click through, that's me. And then in terms of the content, I'll do a little bit of kind of high-level context, kind of looking back, kind of what's happened over the last few years, then get into where we are today. I'm going to talk about growth quite a lot. And also talk about the demographics of labour forces quite a lot, which I think is an important and hopefully an interesting theme that is relevant to us within this particular part of Europe, but also more broadly. I've got a couple of slides on some slightly different topics that perhaps will be topics for discussion at future forums, and then I'll close. And then Bo has promised me a few minutes on Q&A. So, in terms of context, many of you will have seen this word, but if you haven't, this is a word that was coined a couple of years ago, really to describe a phase in the cycle for the globe of what's going on, this kind of idea that we've got continuous and overlapping crises affecting the world and the way the world operates. And I think we could see that very clearly. Coronavirus very, very clearly in 2020, extending for around about 3 years. Before we know it, as we were coming out of that, the Ukraine crisis started, and that then triggered energy prices and inflation, cost of living issues. There's also probably kind of more in the background, probably less obvious in Europe, but it's there no doubt, is the kind of the trade war between China and the US. That has had effect. We've also had some really quite kind of localized issues like the issues in the Red Sea right now that affect shipping, which have an effect on economics. So we're in this kind of cycle of crises. And I think it's been quite convenient for politicians to point the finger at global crises to kind of account for the difficulties with economics. Our view is that whilst there is some truth in that, there's lots of other things going on that have led to where we are right now. I shall stop for a short drink. This isn't a gin and tonic. So, I've also been told that if I overrun, Bo's going to come and knock me off the stage, so I better keep going. If we go back a year and a half, I think most people were looking at this situation. We could see very high inflation, and it was still going up in many, many countries, perhaps less so in the three that we're specifically talking about, kind of Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. We saw high debt, but also we were looking at a period of low growth. But also, 12 months ago, there were a lot of concerns about the risks to global financial stability. 3 American banks went bust in short succession. Credit Suisse got into difficulty and obviously kind of got rolled into UBS. And I think a lot of people were really very concerned that that could be the trigger point for another global financial crisis. And I think a lot of people were concerned that there would be really quite significant recession. And recession is, I think, generally kind of measured as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And whilst some countries have experienced that, That hasn't been the experience kind of globally. Our belief is that the difficulties that we've been seeing over the course of the last couple of years, particularly this spike in inflation, were driven by a series of factors that have been building up for around about 12, 13 years following the financial crisis of 2008-9, triggered by the crises of coronavirus and the Ukraine war. But the underlying economic fundamentals have led to the position that we've been in. So what are they? We've had a period of ultra cheap money. We know that in some countries there have been negative lending rates, zero and negative lending rates. And for some people, that's the only thing they've ever experienced. Some younger people, the only thing they've ever experienced. And of course, when you have very, very low lending rates, it stimulates consumption, both from a consumer and a business perspective. We've also seen in a lot of countries very, very high levels of public spending. So government spending significantly more than their tax receipts. And so they fill the gap by borrowing. And so of course, rising levels of debt that have to be serviced, the interest repayments have to be serviced. On the supply side globally, and this goes back quite a long time, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on, we've seen relatively lackluster productivity gains over the course of the last 15, 20 years. And productivity is a really important constituent component of growth. And so the capacity to meet rising demand, driven on the demand side, has been somewhat suppressed. And then also on the supply side, and I'll talk about this in detail, we see labour market constraints, particularly in advanced economies. And I'll come on to that. That's another long-term trend that I think is really quite important. So our view on the topic of polycrisis, absolutely, we're in this kind of era of crisis after crisis after crisis, and let's hope that things start to stabilise. But our view very clearly is that the crises that have occurred have been the trigger points for the economic adjustment that we've seen over the last couple of years, the inflation spike, the cost of living challenges. But they didn't cause it. It was the underlying fundamentals that were building towards that for an extended period of time that have actually led to the adjustment. So where are we right now? So this is an IMF slide, and I think it's a really simple kind of description of what's going on globally. Of course, the globe is made up of several hundred countries, so we're trying to distill it down, but the global economy is still growing at around about 3%. 3% last year, projected 3.1% this year, 3.2% next year. Advanced economies, and that includes us, it's been quite a lot softer. And there has been a dip, and expected to be a further dip in 2024 with a bit of bounce back. But we're looking at advanced economies on average growing at 1.6, 1.8%, that kind of range. Not disastrous, not recession, but not super exciting. But then we are seeing emerging economies, and from the kind of the economic lexicon, countries like China and India are still included in the kind of category of emerging economies, even though China is the second biggest economy in the world and India is catching it up and might overtake it before too long. But the emerging economies are growing really quite significantly. So whilst there was a risk of recession 18 months ago, I think in reality, to global perspective, that hasn't come through. There have been challenges, undoubtedly. If we just look a little bit more deeply at the countries in this area, so the chart on the on my right-hand side, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and what we can see is a dip in growth in 2023. Netherlands just managed to achieve positive growth overall, but really only just kind of marginally. We're expecting a bounce back for all three countries in 2024, and then kind of stabilising 2025 onwards. And then our near neighbours, kind of Finland, Sweden, and Germany, we see actually really quite a painful experience in 2023 with a very, very marginal bounce back in growth. This is GDP growth in 2024, and it's going to be until 2025 until we start to see some kind of normalization there. If we then compare, again, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands to, I've said emerging economies, I've included the US within this category. The US is the pale grey bar, a little bit difficult to see, but you can see the difference. So the emerging economies, I mean, particularly India, you know, growing at 7-8%, really very, very strong growth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that's important because we operate in a global economy, a competitive economy, and we're seeing these emerging economies really performing very, very strongly versus the advanced economies of Europe and North America. If I talk a little bit about unemployment, I think one of the interesting things about the last 2 to 3 years, and there has been absolutely financial challenges and there's been declines in growth, as I've mentioned, but the unemployment rate hasn't significantly increased in many countries, and in many countries actually unemployment rate has gone down. So if we look at Denmark, the unemployment rate has reduced between 2019 and current position today. And that, I think, reflects this position where the labour markets in these countries are still relatively tight. There's a lot of dynamics in the workforce, but what we see advanced economies having a relative shortfall of available labour. And so even when there's an economic downturn, mostly people aren't being made unemployed. And of course, from a credit perspective, that's good because generally there's a correlation between unemployment and credit risk. People who maintain their jobs, even if they go into reduced hours or they go into kind of a gig economy type environment, will maintain their credit repayments at some level. So we're kind of in this kind of era where we've had an economic downturn, but not an increase in unemployment, not a significant increase in unemployment, and in some cases, no increase at all. Inflation, I'm sure you're all very, very aware of this. You know, we've seen this very, very sharp spike. You know, as I said, economic underlying fundamental factors that have led to it, triggered by particularly the Ukraine crisis and then the energy crisis that followed that. We're seeing that return of normal levels of inflation nearly. So Norway is a bit of an exception. Norway, obviously, the economy is heavily influenced by oil and gas, and that's an important part of the inflation picture there. I think interestingly, if you look at the chart here on this side, I've done the United States in red, and I've put the US on a number of these slides just because it's such a big economy and it's so important globally. The level of inflation, the reduction in inflation has slowed a little in the US, and that has translated directly into the caution that the Federal Reserve has had regarding base rates, and I'll come on to that in a second. So from a lending rate perspective, again, you'll all be very, very familiar with that. We're right at the kind of point of the peak of the curve in terms of bank rates. We're expecting a reduction in central bank lending rates very, very soon. Our expectation of Experian is that it now looks like there's going to be 2 reductions this year. Maybe June, July, first one. July probably more likely than June. And then another one in the autumn. I think a lot of people are looking at the Fed. The ECB tend to be relatively cautious. And I think that the other central banks will kind of look to, particularly the European central banks, will look to what the ECB does as well. But I think we're expecting it to come. And I think we're all expecting there to be a sustained period of reduction in lending rates, but also we're not expecting those lending rates to reduce to the levels that they were before the economic adjustment. So those, you can see that extended period from 2010 through to 2022, where for a number of countries, the lending rates were essentially close to zero, and in some cases, actually, in Sweden's case, we're in a negative position. We aren't expecting anything like that. So probably coming back to somewhere between 2 to 3% for an extended period of time. From a debt perspective, I talked about high debt, and I think it's absolutely true. When you look at globally the position, many countries have grown public debt. They've been spending more than their tax receipts, so fill the gap with debt, as I mentioned earlier. Northern Europe actually has been much more disciplined. So you can see here, I mean, first of all, the differential of the Northern European countries with the US. In absolute terms, the level of debt as a percentage of government debt as a percentage of GDP. But you can also see that between 2004, 2014 and 2024, in many cases, the level of public debt has declined. So there's been really kind of strict fiscal discipline. And that's a real opportunity if governments decide that they want to spend some of that money. So if you look at Denmark is in a budget surplus position. Does the government want to use some of that money to stimulate the economy? That's a political decision. I think kind of history would say probably there's going to be a degree of caution, but there's undoubtedly an opportunity versus other countries, and prime example being the US. I said earlier I'd talk a little bit about growth. Of course, growth is the thing that certainly from a business context we all look for. We want to grow our businesses, we want to grow top line, and we want to grow profitability. And economically, kind of the same story. We want to grow economies. It makes us all a little bit better off as the economy grows, and keeps everything moving forwards. There are some really kind of significant challenges to growth. So this is the slide I looked at earlier, just reinforcing the fact the differential between the growth projections of advanced economies versus emerging economies. If we kind of break down what lies behind economic growth, and this is growth in gross domestic product, the output of the economy, it's a simple equation, but I think it's quite useful. If you think about growth, there are two main drivers for it. There's the productivity of the labor force. So how much output can each person generate, multiplied by the size of the workforce. And of course, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of factors that sit behind those, but from a conceptual perspective, really quite a simple way of looking at it. If you want to get growth into your economy, get your people to be more productive and have more people. And both of those in advanced economies have proven to be and will prove to be a challenge. So from a labour productivity perspective, this is an OECD chart, so it's got a mix of different countries, and doesn't have the Nordic countries or the Netherlands, but it's got Germany. I think Germany is a good case in point. What this is showing is the average growth rate in labour productivity, and the blue column is the average of 1990 to 1999, so the end of the last century. And then the purple column is the average of the period 2013 to 2022. And so what this is showing is in each country, Japan, France, Germany, and so on, whilst there is still growth in productivity, the growth rates have declined. And behind that, what we see is that a lot of the growth in productivity that was achieved in the last quarter of the last century were improvements in manufacturing productivity. It's been far more difficult to translate the productivity gains into the service sector. And so many of the advanced economies are progressively more reliant on service sector than on manufacturing. And so the absence of the ability to deliver productivity gains is a challenge. We're going to talk a lot about this. I know a number of speakers are going to talk about Gen AI. I think there is a real belief that Gen AI will enable advanced economies to break this productivity challenge. this labour productivity challenge, particularly in back office functions. I mean, we're looking at it in a number of different ways, but I know kind of, organisations are looking at it at making coding more effective or customer services more effective. So I think Gen AI is a great opportunity for advanced economies to start to get more forward motion on productivity, labour productivity. So that was kind of the labour productivity side of the growth equation. The other side is the workforce piece, and I think this probably is more significant and a bigger challenge. So the first chart talks about the percentage of the population that is of working age, and I've put the Nordic economies on. I put Germany on as well, but also put India, the dotted line at the top. And what you can see is that India, this kind of rapidly emerging economy, they have got more of the population that is of working age, so more of the population available to work to support growth. But actually that percentage is going to rise over the course of the next 10 years. There is some slowing in the last 2 to 3 years as the population naturally will begin to age, but a bigger proportion of the population available within the economy to grow. Conversely, if we look at the Netherlands or look at Germany, you're seeing a very, very distinct difference. I mean, Germany is such a big economy in Europe, so important in Europe. They have a smaller proportion of the population than India who are of working age, so it's an older population, but that curve is declining, and really very, very significantly. Less people available to work within the economy. And we look at, similar in Denmark and in Norway and in Sweden, the UK, France, Italy, Spain, probably Spain, less so Spain, but a lot of what we would consider to be advanced economies have got this challenge. And then we look on the right-hand side, the second chart, and then how many of those people of working age are actually participating in work. Germany, it's kind of pretty close to everyone, 87.8%. It's a very high proportion of those people available to work. So the headroom for growth in Germany of getting those people, because the 12% or so that aren't available for work have made a very conscious decision and they don't want to be working, most likely. India, less than half are working. So the headroom in India. So you've got this kind of demographic dynamic in India of more and more people being available for work, yet the headroom anyway is very significant. So if you think about that as a driver of growth, that's really very, very significant. And it's a real challenge for all advanced economies. And it brings into it, one of the questions it brings in is immigration. And immigration is a combination of an economic and a political kind of topic, and often quite challenging. But if we can't deliver productivity gains and we have got a declining workforce, where is growth going to come from? And then just a final thought. Again, interestingly, this is an OECD chart. When we look at advanced economies and we look at Northern Europe, and I'm including kind of Germany in there as well, our countries, on average, work the least number of hours. So you've got another dimension of availability of labour to grow the economy. And that's a very kind of conscious choice. There's lots of social and legal reasons why the countries represented here work on average less hours than other countries around the world. It's a very clear choice, but it has an economic impact. So things to think about. I've talked a little bit about India. Won't spend a long time on this. Clearly not part of our region, but I showed this slide at the EMAP sale, the Experian EMAP sales conference a few weeks ago, and a number of the folk from our Indian business came up to me and said, "We're going to be the third largest economy by 2026, not 2027." They're kind of, it's really moving. And I've already kind of talked about the workforce. You've got this young, growing and educated workforce. You've got a very vibrant technology sector, so they're delivering productivity gains. And they've got very strong underlying domestic demand, unlike China, And actually my Indian colleagues were telling me that 6% growth was a little bit kind of conservative and it would be more like 7 or 8%. But you know, I'm really kind of showing you this just to think about the dynamic between this region that will have probably, you know, 1.5, 1.7, 1.8% growth for a sustained period of time, and versus this economy that's just exploding at the minute. And how does that change the world? Two slightly different thoughts, and this first one I think we could spend an entire day on if we wanted to, but perhaps it's a topic we'll pick up at either future roundtables or future events like this. It's the effect of the environmental changes that we're seeing and the risks that this poses to gross domestic product, to economic growth. The first chart is from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Organization, and that's showing the concentration of CO2 over the past 800,000 years. It's not often I get to present a slide that goes back 800,000 years, and I think we can all see, and we all know what's happening. We are seeing climate change, and there's a lot of concern that the increase in global temperatures is going to get out of control. This chart here is put together by the Swiss Re Institute. Their job is to be a little bit gloomy. They're kind of, you know, part of a risk and insurance organisation that is going to look at downside. So it might not turn out this way. But what they're calling out here is they're saying, as temperature rises, there will be economic consequences, and the hotter it gets, the more severe those consequences will be. And no great surprise, the less advanced, economically advanced countries, typically in the hotter parts of the world, will be most exposed and most affected by those changes. It's impossible to say whether the quantum of these impacts, because these impacts are all measured as the potential percentage reduction in gross domestic product as a result of climate change. So there's some pretty big numbers, but I think it's really kind of the directional, it's the threat that this kind of talks to that I think is really very important, and I think is a topic probably that we ought to come back to again. And then final kind of content slide. Some of you might be familiar with something called the World Happiness Index. There's an organisation, I think it's called the World Happiness Forum. They developed a number of criteria for assessing happiness within countries. And what we can see here in the chart is that there is a pretty strong correlation between economic performance and advanced economies and happiness. Now, the economic components of the index are only about, I think there's 6 main factors, and 1.5 of them are kind of linked to economics. There's lots of other things about social justice and culture, but you can see there's a pretty kind of strong correlation. The dark blue are advanced economies, the light grey ones that you can barely see, emerging and middle market, and then the purple ones are the lower income developing countries. You can see that Finland, I don't know if we have anybody from Finland in the audience, but if we do, you are the happiest person in the room, which is great to hear. But we see that after that, I know there are a lot of Danes in the room. Danes are pretty happy. Icelanders, Swedes, Israel, maybe that's slightly out of date. The Netherlands and so on. But you know, there is a correlation between economic performance and happiness. So there is some good news in terms of, you know, where we are right now. And then just in conclusion, we undoubtedly have had a period of economic turmoil. We've had adjustment, the inflation adjustment that has been certainly painful for some. Looks like it's behind us. Our view very much is we're just on the cusp of a global economic recovery that is likely to be sustained for a number of years. So we're expecting unless anything horrible happens, another very significant crisis that takes us back, we're expecting a sustained period of growth and hopefully stability. We're all expecting, I think, Gen AI to be a big part of that. And I think the big challenge for advanced economies is, can we use AI to drive innovation and productivity gains that will stimulate the economy? And we're very fortunate to be some of the happiest countries on earth. So that was me. I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andy. Always interesting. And I think, a very clever strategy from your side to use all the time so you don't get any tricky questions from the audience. So I like that. But if there is, we can have one question. Is there just one question from anybody in the room or online? Any questions from Andy? Yeah, there is actually. So we'll take this one over here. Yeah, but we have the microphone here. Yeah.
We have two, don't we? Yep.
I'm the next speaker, so maybe I'm cheating a bit here. But you didn't mention the risks and well, the consequences of potential deglobalization coming out of trade wars, tariff wars, and geopolitical risk as such. Is that because you don't think it's that we're able to measure that and size it up yet, or is it because you don't think it's significant?
Yeah, I think in the main, I think our view is it's kind of already priced in to the forecasts. The tension between China and the US has been going on for some time. There's obviously a lot of politics behind it. Who gets in? Is it Biden or Trump? And where does that take us? I think also there's the reality that within a 30-minute slot, there's only so much you can talk about. So, yeah.
Okay, we have one last question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Daniel from PropCloud, first of all, thank you for being invited here. It was great presentation. My question relates sort of to the cost of borrowing and the increase in interest rates that we've had that you touched upon. The numbers that we see economically with respect to the relatively low unemployment rates, and although we've had a slightly lower growth, the growth numbers in the economies have been pretty stable. I think better than what people feared, especially after Silicon Valley Bank and those started to go under. But Larry Summers was the head of the Treasury or the Fed or one of those, published an article where he argued that when we measure inflation, the cost of borrowing isn't included in the basket of goods that they use to measure it. So his argument was that if you include the cost of borrowing in the inflation rate actually peaked at closer to 20% than the 12 or something that you showed.
Yep.
And therefore it feels for the average consumer like the economy is worse than what is evident from the charts that you showed. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that, and if you have any, how it relates to Experian's measurement of credit risk and the feedback loop that is between the cost of borrowing and the rising interest rates.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, of course, the purpose of monetary policy and putting up interest rates is to take money out of people's pockets so that they can't spend it in general consumption within the economy and that will bring down consumption, therefore bring down prices. Undoubtedly there are proportions of the economy, of people within the economy who have got exposure to debt where the effect of the interest rate increase is very significant. If you combine that, if that group overlaps also with the people who are most exposed from a general economic downturn and the general increases in inflation and cost of living, then for that proportion, that's really quite acute. But I think that what we've seen from a credit risk perspective is that group that's got that double whammy effect, the monetary policy effect on their borrowings and the general inflation, is quite small. And I think also people have been able to navigate the risk quite effectively. So we've actually seen relatively little very adverse credit risk activity from those populations. I think there's a period that will hold true. Beyond that, then it becomes a real challenge. But what we're seeing is, I think we're seeing the expectation that interest rates will come down. Actually, if you look at kind of commercial lending rates, in some cases they've been coming down already in expectation of central bank lending rates. So I think that, yes, absolutely there's an exposure, but relatively short term and for a relatively small proportion of the population.
Thank you so much, Andy. A round of applause for Andy Wells.
Thank you.